friends, in the series which we are doing on understanding popular culture, today we'll talk about Indian cinema, mapping influence of national struggle for independence, part 3. Earlier in the two lectures in part 1 and part 2, we talked about the various kinds of genres during the independence movement in the context of the films, and these genres, how they interacted in the context of the freedom movement, how some of the themes they were relevant in the context of the ideas or ideals which were connected to the national movement, and some of the films in the various genres, whether the mythologicals, devotionals, stunt films, social reform theme films, all these films, they reflected the ideals of the national movement. Today we'll talk about the issues concerning the censorship, that how some of the films which were made during this particular period, how they drew some kind of a air of the colonial censors, how colonial censors they did not like these kinds of films, and they many a times deleted the dialogues or various scenes from these films. So censors they exercised their authority in that sense, in terms of cutting those scenes through the censor scissors, and at the same time the filmmakers, from the Indian point of view, they tried to hoodwink the censor authorities by incorporating some of the dialogues or themes which were connected with the national movement. In that context, the kind of books which one can refer, or the references, is Gautam Kaul, Cinema and the Indian Freedom Struggle, Aruna Vasudev, Liberty and License in Indian Cinema, S.T. Bhaskaran, Message Bearers, Nationalist Politics and Entertainment Media in South India from 1880 to 1945, Feroz Rangoonwala, 75 Years of Indian Cinema. So these are some of the readings which one can refer when one is talking about the ideals of national movement and how they were being connected with the censorship machinery, and how the films they tried to in a way present those themes or ideas so that the cinegoers they become aware about those kinds of themes. And when we tend to understand that how Indian films they were being censored by the colonial censors, and not only the Indian films but at the same time many foreign films which came from America, which had the ideals of democratic aspirations, or films from Russia which were dealing with the revolutionary themes. So all of them they were not in a way suiting the colonial policies and colonial rulers. They rejected these kinds of portrayals. And on the other hand, we find that how the Indian filmmakers they tried to project these kinds of themes which were considered to be nationalist in nature in their films. And some of the films which one can talk about, one was Bhakt Vidur of the 1921. It was a silent film which was depicting the story of Vidur of Mahabharat in an allegorical portrayal of Gandhi's political activities. And Vidurji, as he was referred to in the subtitles, was shown supporting a Gandhi cap, clad in khaddar, sitting beside a charkha to spin yarn, all being powerful symbols of the freedom struggle. So what we see is that these silent films, because Gandhi had already come to India in 1915, and thereafter he engrosses himself after a period of around 1.5 years in the national movement. We see that beginning from Champaran, and then Ahmedabad mill strike, Kheda Satyagrah, and then finally the Rowlatt agitation, and thereafter the non-cooperation, Khilafat and non-cooperation, all of them. So these were the movements in which Gandhiji was involved, and such kind of portrayals, especially during that point of time, which were reflecting the national movement leaders or their ideals. So censors they were not very supportive of such kind of ideas, and we find that when such pictures they were being made, then various scenes they were being deleted from such films, and how they were being connected to the recent political events in Bombay, for example, that when peasants they refused to pay tax in 1918, and the evacuation of town by people as a protest against the government in 1921 in Chirala. So S.T. Bhaskaran talks about these kinds of connections, and how these connections, they were very, very important at that point of time, and how people, they could relate with these kinds of connections. And when such kind of portrayals, they were being made, then we find that even in the court scenes where the Dhritarashtra is being shown, who is being represented as the king emperor in the film, and how people, they were being given the kind of awards in such kind of scenes, that the people, those who were loyal, they were being given the titles of the Donkey Bahadur. And these kinds of titles, they were some kind of a spoof on the Diwan Bahadur titles which were given by the British, and the government did not like it, and it called it some kind of a thinly veiled resume of the political events in India. So we find that this kind of a problem with regard to censorship, it began at a very initial level, and even some of the films which were not directly in a way coming in the context, in the contestation of the censorship machinery, how these films, they were also being interpreted by the colonial censors, whether even Raja Harishchandra, for example, where the ideals of Satyagraha, they were being shown, and later how people, they also got associated with Satyagraha in the national movement as well. And we find that even a film called Battleship Potemkin, which was made by Eisenstein, and how the Commissioner of Police in Bombay, in his capacity as the chairman of the censor board, he saw it in the context of that this film was dealing with the mutiny of sailors on the Russian cruiser Potemkin at Odisha in 1903, and their final escape with their ships into the Romanian waters. So any theme which was in a way considered to be revolutionary in nature, any theme which had the kind of democratic aspirations which were there in many of the films which were made in America, they were being rejected by the censors, and the censorship machinery considered it propagandist in nature. And that is how we see the kind of censorship which was there during the colonial times. It was censorship of opportunity, and how the colonial censors or the British censors, they wanted to reject anything which was remotely connected with the national movement. And scholars like Chidanand Dasgupta have argued that it provided a magnificent objective impression of the revolutionary impulse when he talks about Potemkin, and depicted combined feelings of mass of people. So this is how scholars, they have tried to see the films which were being shown in India. And we also find that ICC, or the Indian Cinematograph Committee, it was also being appointed to look into the matters which were concerned with the Indian cinema. And T. Rangacharya was appointed as the chairman of this committee, and he spent considerable time along with the other members of this committee, and finally they suggested certain points with regard to the way the films, they are being exhibited in India, or what kind of steps the government should take with regard to the exhibition and production of films in India. And they argued that a central board of censors be established for the whole of British India, and such board would give the authoritative decisions for the whole country and would achieve the uniformity in judgment. And this board was to be established at Bombay, and it should consist of 7 or 9 members, and a majority of whom should be the non-official Indians. And the committee also talked about a deputy censor at Calcutta for the censorship of imported films, and provincial boards wherever necessary for censoring of the locally produced feature films. So Indian Cinematograph Committee made a kind of a detailed report about the way it went into the question of the Indian cinema or Indian films, and thereafter the kind of recommendations which were made by it to the government, some of them they were accepted, and some of them they were not given adherence to by the government of India. And it also talked about that where no central or the provincial board exists, then the power should be given to the presidency or the DM to certify these topical films. And it also discussed the functioning of the centralized censorship, and it expressed that it will be able to function with minimum criticism and maximum uniformity and authority. So these were some of the suggestions which were being given by the ICC, and how some of the national movement leaders, initially they were not very supportive of the chairman who was being appointed. One case was of Lala Lajpat Rai, who initially criticized the appointment of T. Rangacharya or raised questions in the Legislative Assembly. But later on, when he saw the report and the kind of recommendations which were made by it, then he expressed his regret that the kind of questions which he raised about T. Rangacharya were not relevant from the kind of report which he has submitted now. And we also see that many films apart from Bhakt Vidur as well, they were talking about the ideas of religious bigotry, caste system, untouchability, etc., and how certain kind of resemblance with the movement, national movement leaders, for example Gandhi, for whom the caste and creed was not all that important. And this could be seen in a film called Rath, which was made in 1931, where the Gandhian principles and his philosophy, they were being talked about by a lookalike character of Gandhi, and they sent shivers down the censor's spine, and many of the scenes, they were being deleted from it. And later we find that a much truncated version of this film was shown as Khuda Ki Shaan in the later times. So we find that such kind of portrayals which were connected with the national movement, how they were being in a way rejected by the colonial censors. And not only the concerns which were there with regard to the national movement, but there were other concerns of the central of the censor board, apart from the ideals of the national movement. They were concerned. They were also concerned with the issues concerning the portrayal of the Muslims. They were also concerned with the issues concerning the portrayal of the working classes. And in that sense, how the British censors, they were sensitive to the themes of the strikes of the workers, or the ideals of communism or opposition to capitalism, and they kept some kind of an eye on such kind of scenes. And we find that one film called Mil or Mazdoor was connected in this context, which was written by Munshi Premchand, and it was a portrayal of the labor capital conflict, and talked about the deplorable conditions of the working class in the factories. And we find that this film was also in a way being banned for the travesty of the mill life and the management, and they felt that if the people will watch this film in the context of the effect will be that it is likely that it is going to be harmful to the relations between the employers and the workers in India. And later we find that a censored version was released in 1935 under the new title Seth Ki Ladki or Merchant's Daughter. So we find that any film which was not in the context of the ideas which British had in the context of the exhibition of films in India, they were being rejected by the censors. And wherever they felt that such kind of portrayals which will be detrimental to the image of the British, or they will be in a way dangerous to the colonial rule in India, all such kind of portrayals, they were being rejected by the colonial censors. And this film was again prohibited by the censors because the censors, they argued that there is running throughout the film the idea of conflict of labor and capital, and that much of the film depicts squandering by members of the capitalist class of money earned by labor, in contrast with the squalid conditions under which labor lives, and that it is a direct incitement to discontent in labor circles. So this is how such kind of portrayals which were dealing with the issues of the capital and the labor, or the capitalist and the working class. And that is how we see that how Munshi Premchand was not satisfied with the way his film was being presented on the screen, and thereafter we do not find that he wrote for any other film as well. And Aruna Vasudev has talked about in her book Liberty and License in Indian Cinema, that how this film was later released again in March 1936 as Dayaki Devi, or Goddess of Mercy, and many deletions they were being made in this film. All scenes of rowdyism on the part of mill hands, such as beating of mill officers, they were entirely omitted, and all scenes of mob incitement they were also considerably toned down. So these kind of deletions where the mill hands and at the same time the owners of the mill, they came into any kind of a conflict with each other, and where the scenes of the seduction of women workers in the mill by the mill management, etc., they were also being rejected by the censors. Or wherever we see that the scenes which were showing the strikes of the workers, or the employment of the blacklegs to break the strike, or picketing by the strikers, they were reduced to a minimum, because British, they were always scared that such kind of portrayals they will not be healthy in the context of the colonial rule, and they may spread in other sections of the society, and it may prove very detrimental to the colonial rule there. So these were the kind of ideas which British had. They were always very apprehensive of such kind of portrayals, and the rising popularity of the communist among the peasants and workers, that could also be seen during this particular period. And at the same time we find the impact of the Marxist ideas on the revolutionary movement under the influence of Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad and Yogesh Chandra Chatterjee. So British, they were fearful of such kind of ideas which were there at that point of time, and we see that during this particular period when films they were being made, various strands of the national movement could be seen. The national movement in the context of the Congress party, thereafter how the peasants and the workers, they were also having their own sphere or area where they were also participating independently of the Congress party. Then at the same time we also find the revolutionary movement, where revolutionaries, they were also gaining some kind of a prominence with their activities, and the various phases of the revolutionary movement as well. They created some kind of a fear among the British. And we also find that in the later times, in 1930s and 40s, Congress Socialist Party, peasant and workers movements, they could also be seen, as you can see on the screen as well. And other organizations like All India Trade Union Congress, All India Kisan Sabha, all of them they were also contributing in some way. And what made the British scared of such kind of activities by the varied groups, that how the imperialist government felt that there was some kind of a communist danger because of the kind of interventions which were being made by the various Kisan Sabhas or trade union congress, etc. So British, they were always scared from the kind of domestic developments which were happening in India. And we also find from the international point of view, the development of former Soviet Union during the Great Depression was also very important, and how the communist ideas, they were also in a way influencing, its reach was increasing on the European intellectual community and in China. So from the international point of view, we find that British, they had their own fears, and they were in a way scared of these kinds of international developments, and how these international developments may affect their chances in India. So that was also in their minds. And we also see that the growth of the strength of the Communist Party of China, CPC, in comparison to Kuomintang or KMT. So all this led to the spreading of the ideas of communism, class struggle, and the colonial government became quite apprehensive or scared or fearful of such kind of ideas, that these ideas may not spread to India, and India, some kind of a revolution in India may not appear. And when we see this in the context of the various films, we find that some of the films like Sant Tulsidas, the producers they were ordered to omit the entire scenes referring to the questions of admittance of low caste persons to a Hindu temple. Mahatma, which was made in 1935, which was based on the life of Saint Eknath and his fight against untouchability, was released with many accessions as Dharmatma. So what British did, that wherever they felt that any of the scenes or the dialogues they will not be suitable from the British point of view, then they asked the censor, then the censor authorities, they deleted these kinds of dialogues, and they also deleted various kinds of scenes as well. And they felt that any kind of themes which were related to the socio-religious reform movements, which were based on the lives of the various saints of the medieval times of the Bhakti movement, and how they could also be linked to the reform movement which was launched by Mahatma Gandhi, and how any kind of a danger in the context of propagation of these ideas could take place, and they could also be linked to the Gandhian objectives, ideology, and the movement as well. So we find that all these kinds of things created a lot of fear among the minds of the British, and British they were scared of these kinds of ideas. They did not want that any ideas which are connected with the themes of democracy or the themes of revolution, they may be propagated in any manner, and the Indians they may in any way not be influenced by such ideas and pose any kind of a challenge to the British. So we will talk about the censorship ideas which are concerned with the national movement in the context of the films further in our next lecture. Thank you very much.